I'm Kat Timpf.
I'm Bill Hemmer.
I'm Harris Faulkner, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, June 25th, 2021. I'm Jessica Rosenthal. The debate about race and policing reignited after the murder of George Floyd, and the officer convicted of killing him will be sentenced today.
Police and race are so entwined that you can't separate the two.
We speak with former NYPD Police Commissioner Bill Bratton.
I'm Chris Foster. A Supreme Court ruling and new state laws have college athletes closer to getting paid.
The college model, as we know and have lived and seen it over basically all of our lives, is in severe straits in terms of being able to continue going forward.
Clay Travis is a Fox News sports contributor.
And I'm Joe Concha. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
2 months ago, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was convicted of murdering George Floyd.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty.
He was also convicted of third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter, and today Chauvin is scheduled to be sentenced. Second-degree murder alone can result in up to 40 years in prison. After the verdict, Floyd's family and supporters spoke out in relief, but Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison said at the time that it should mark a beginning of sorts.
This verdict reminds us that we must make enduring, systemic, societal change. More than a month ago, the Minnesota Public Safety Commissioner John Harrington and I released the recommendations of our working group on reducing deadly force encounters with law enforcement. What all of us in that working group, including law enforcement, wanted is for everyone to go home safe. We need to use this verdict as an inflection point.
After Floyd's murder, protests began around the country. Soon after, there was talk of national police reform, even defunding police departments. Since then, crime has risen further, especially violent crime. And the debate continues to shift about the kinds of police reforms that are needed and what city and state governments should be spending money on, as the defund police crowd demands that more be spent on social programs.
My experience goes over a 50-year period, came into policing in 1970 at a time of also great societal change, civil rights movement, anti-war movement.
Bill Bratton is the former police chief of New York, Los Angeles, and Boston's police departments.
And today in 2021, we are now in another, what I would describe as revolutionary period. And it's an exciting time in many respects, but it's also a challenging time. Challenging with rising crime rates and concern and fear of crime, racial tension. Exciting in that out of this crisis comes the opportunity to maybe make significant advances in, one, dealing more effectively with crime and disorder, and two, at the same time, improving the race relations in this country that have been so problematic over so many centuries now.
As people talk about, police reform, race, defunding police, or refunding them now, what would you say is the reason we got here to this moment, and how did the issues surrounding policing really explode after George Floyd in an even bigger way than after, Michael Brown and Ferguson or Eric Garner or Freddie Gray and others? And I think I'm asking you to give us a little bit of a history lesson and take you back in time here to maybe the 80s and 90s.
Well, a history lesson is something I spent a lot of time on in the book, The Profession. It's a memoir. It's a tutorial, but it's also the history of policing through my experiences over those 50 years. And we are constantly reforming, constantly changing. But some of the constants are the issue of race and racial tensions in this country, issues around police and how police perform and behave. And the reality is police and race are so entwined that you can't separate the two. You're not going to resolve a lot of the racial tension in this country, a lot of the concerns around police performance, behavior, effectiveness, without addressing both of them at the same time. And that's certainly what we're in the midst of at the moment. An extraordinary crisis of confidence in police to effectively deal with issues of race and with our country's minority population, particularly our black population. So the tensions that exploded around George Floyd, I think, took us all by surprise. Because for a number of years, we've been dealing with the Ferguson effect, so-called Ferguson effect. And we thought we were resolving some of those issues. But quite clearly, the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, nobody expected that explosion. And what was different this time was it wasn't just the black community coming out to demonstrate and express concern. It was joined by a phenomenal amount, a cross-section of America, whites and others, different age groups, and estimated 20, 25 million people participated in those demonstrations. So quite clearly, a nerve had been touched with this murder. And out of crises comes opportunity, and that was reflected in the president's remarks, where he intends to spend billions of dollars on a broad-based set of strategies to address what he believes are all the issues that have been exposed by the tension around George Floyd's murder. So let's hope that's the case as we go forward, that we continue this arc of reform that went on for much of our history.
I do want to ask you about President Biden's reform plans, but I want to ask you first, how do we transition now? You said that these issues of race and policing are entwined. They cannot be separated. And I want to follow up on that because one of my questions is, it seems like there can be no more room for error, bad judgment, whatever you want to call it. Someone of color who turned out to be unarmed, but maybe was running and reaching for a cell phone, simply cannot be shot and killed by police again. I feel like if there's another incident, it will just continue this argument. It will just continue this debate and this festering issue. And I'm just wondering, is it possible? Like, can any kind of police reform achieve that?
No, that's the sad reality. You will always have incidents of unarmed people killed by the police, blacks or otherwise. The good news is that the number of incidents has been in decline. Washington Post probably has the most accurate accounting of that going back to 2015. In an average year, about 1,000 people are killed by police in about 3,000 incidents involving police engaging in gun battles or, in some instances, using force against an unarmed person, whether that person not armed with a gun, but with some other weapon on. In the case of George Floyd, no weapon at all. So good news is those numbers have been declining. Bad news is you're always going to have incidents like this, but what you try to do is learn from each one. We've learned a lot from the George Floyd incident, and that's bringing about phenomenal thinking and initiatives to try to reduce the times that police have to deal with the mentally ill, the drug addicted, or the others who are in emotional distress. And so there's going to be a lot of experiments going on around the country that hopefully reduce even further these incidents.
Well, if there is an experiment that does work, I hope you weigh in on it and tell us about it, that you find that it works or you think it works. Let's go back to President Biden. This week, he addressed the rise in violent crime that we are seeing, and he said he's been doing this for a long time and we know what works. And then he followed that up by saying you have to address background checks, make them more stringent, and go after rogue gun dealers. Assault weapons bans are good in his mind. And he used the term assault weapons, and backing community policing and social programs. Those were the three that he listed. Is that wrong? Is it missing something? Or is it on target as far as you're concerned?
No, of the three you identified, and those were three elements of a much larger package you talked about. The gun licensing issues, I think there's a lot of support among the public for that. Unfortunately, there's not political support. I don't think you're going to see much progress on that one, unfortunately. On the issue of assault weapons ban, he's going back to the 1994 crime bill that he helped to inaugurate, where we had the 10-year ban. It had some good effects. I don't see that moving forward either at this time. It didn't move forward after a lot of our mass murders, so I don't see it moving forward at this time again. The fact is we have 30 to 40 million of those weapons already in the hands of American citizens. And they also constitute a relatively small amount of the shootings we're talking about. The third one I think is the most important, and that's this idea of understanding that community policing works in its many elements. And he seems to be potentially putting a lot of resources, money into that one. More cops, more overtime, more research, more community-based efforts to deal with the emotionally ill, the drug addicted, et cetera. So I was impressed with his plan as it was laid out in terms of its comprehensiveness. It was not something obviously done overnight. The gun issues, I'm encouraged by some of the enforcement activity he wants to take. These 5 task forces going into 5 cities that have some of the most violent gang-related gun crime. The strengthening of the ATF that has been weakened dramatically over the last 30 years. If you can get that entity, that agency strengthened once again, that'll be a phenomenal resource to help local police. So a lot of good stuff in that bill. The devil is always in the details, and fortunately a lot of it does not necessarily require congressional approval, as best I can tell.
Finally, I want to go back to what we were speaking about earlier, and that is that race and policing are sort of intertwined. There's the perception among some that there's just a few bad apples among police. And then there's this perception among others that there is something inherently racist about police work. Republican Senator Tim Scott even said he'd been pulled over a number of times as a senator. Some in the bad apple camp say this is about statistics, that it comes down to who's committing more of a given city's crime. And that's the population that police are tasked with going after. I'm wondering, where do you fall on this?
Well, this issue is like a Rubik's Cube, that you've identified several of those squares on that cube, that some of the different arguments. Is there systemic racism in some departments? There is. Is it existing in the profession as a whole? No, I don't believe so. Are there some cops who engage in systemic racist policing practices? Certainly. There's no denying that. Proving that is very difficult. But the issue is that there's no denying the tension between race and policing. And it's compounded by the problem of the high rates of crime, unfortunately, in poorer neighborhoods, many of which are minority neighborhoods and many of which are black neighborhoods, that bring a lot of police into those neighborhoods to deal with those shootings and murders. Something that's not even being looked at closely is the significant increase in police officers being killed in the line of duty. It went up last year. It's now up dramatically again this year. So there's so many elements to this issue that the good news is that we've become much more adept at discussing it. We've become much more able to look at these things with the videos that are available. And there's a lot of desire to change it right now. The most I've ever seen in the 50 years I've been in the business. And before you can solve a problem, you have to admit you have a problem. So no matter what your perspective is about this issue, I think we are all on common ground that there is a problem. And whatever its cause is, it needs to be addressed. And fortunately, there seems to be a lot of willingness to address it at this time.
Former Chief Bill Bratton, author of the new book, The Profession, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure to be with you. All the best. Thank you.
This is Joe Concha with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
It's not getting paid to play, but starting next Thursday, July 1st, college athletes in 6 states will, by law, be allowed to make money off their name, image, and likeness with things like endorsements and appearance fees. The NCAA's board of directors has been meeting to figure out its own plan, for now just allowing student athletes in those states to take advantage of the law, with schools in other states allowed to make their own policies. This is after the Supreme Court ruled unanimously Monday that college basketball and football players can receive education-based financial benefits over the current cap set by the NCAA.
I think it's fairly substantial. Different angles to adopt here. Look, the main 9-0 opinion that was written by Justice Gorsuch dealing with antitrust violations in the way that college athletes are compensated.
Clay Travis is a Fox News sports contributor.
It is much less expansive than basically the roadmap that was provided by Brett Kavanaugh in terms of the overall antitrust issues. And if you read his opinion, which is a concurring opinion, it suggests basically that the college model, as we know and have lived and seen it over basically all of our lives, is in severe straits in terms of being able to continue going forward.
Yeah, I mean, part of the NCAA argument, and just how, like you said, how we've thought of college sports is this sort of amateur purity, I guess. And Justice Kavanaugh wrote, traditions alone cannot justify the NCAA's decision to build a massive money-raising enterprise on the backs of student athletes who aren't fairly compensated. Nowhere else in America can businesses get away with agreeing not to pay their workers a fair market rate on the theory that their product is defined by not paying their workers a fair market rate. So, in other words, the NCAA is making money by espousing these ideals that they're not paying the kids.
Yeah, and of course the complicating factor here is there's a big difference between, say, the starting quarterback for the University of Alabama and a women's field hockey player. And the argument I think that the NCAA would make, if they were able to make a strong argument here, is really the divergent paths there. You have revenue-producing and non-revenue-producing sports. Football and men's basketball makes money. Every other sport at college loses money, and departments would argue that they take the money from the profitable teams and they roll that into scholarships and support for the teams that are not profitable. So really what you have is a dichotomy here between the revenue-producing, a.k.a. the profitable teams, which are a small minority of them, and the non-revenue-producing, losing dollar teams, which are the vast majority. And how are you going to reconcile those? And then it gets more complicated. This is me putting my lawyer hat on. When you consider Title IX, name, image, and likeness, and all of the other complexities that are going to be rolled into attacking the existing collegiate model.
Yeah, this name, image, and likeness thing, 6 states now have laws kicking in July 1st that college athletes can be paid for their name, image, and likeness. Stuff like if you want to do a commercial, license your name to a video game. And I guess it's sort of a split the baby thing where, okay, the kids are now allowed to go out and make that money, but the schools aren't directly paying them.
Yeah, and it'll get complicated, right? Because you can imagine where a school has, let's say, a shoe contract or an apparel contract, and then an individual player wants to have a different contract. You can also imagine what are going to be permissible name, image, and likeness endorsement opportunities. I don't think, for instance, gambling companies, alcohol, or for lack of a better way, strip clubs, right? I mean, I don't think that college athletes would be able to endorse those products and be associated with the university. So figuring out what is and is not appropriate, how the money is going to be distributed, who makes those decisions. I mean, this is just a massive undertaking that I think it'll take the better part of a decade to actually resolve.
Yeah, and those endorsement deals, for example, could be a way to get around the idea of literal bidding wars for recruits.
Yes.
What if Alabama comes in and says, okay, we have a deal in place for sponsors, play here and we'll guarantee you X dollars in endorsement income if you just go to these, car dealership openings, for example.
Yeah, no doubt. And also remember, inside of the teams themselves, there's relatively few athletes who have a really substantial example value. To use your example, Alabama's got a starting quarterback or starting running back or whoever it might be has infinitely more value than an offensive lineman would. And so within the teams themselves, you would create a real divergence in terms of guys that are able to have substantial value in name, image, and likeness. Something as simple as how many people would show up over the years to get, let's say, Tim Tebow's autograph when he played at the University of Florida, compared to the vast majority of University of Florida teammates that Tim Tebow might have, where there would be no money. So does that money get distributed evenly across the entire team? What exactly is the mechanism by which this is going to occur? I think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned it, what happens if that starting quarterback is suddenly pulling in 6-7 figures for endorsement deals, and that offensive lineman who's protecting him is getting bupkis? How does that affect team dynamics?
No doubt, which is why I think some people will argue that what needs to happen, and I think this will be an interesting debate, is does, for instance, all of the name, image, and likeness money roll into a overall fund that is distributed mostly to all of the different athletes? And how's Title IX going to play in here, right? Because male athletes are much more valuable in name, image, and likeness than female athletes, because football and men's basketball are the lion's share of where viewership comes from. So under Title IX, you have to have an equal amount of scholarship athletes for both men and women. How would the funds be distributed? Would we require that a quarterback be compensated the same as a diver? Those are really interesting questions that, again, I think much of the court will have to be figuring out.
Yeah, I mean, or even a women's golfer. I mean, there is no women's football team, so it's not like you can just split it up among the men and women's basketball programs. Well, we'll see how that goes over the next few years. It looks like the writing's on the wall, even if the writing's kind of messy. Clay, another big sports story this week has been Las Vegas Raiders defensive end Carl Nassib coming out as gay. The first publicly gay active NFL player ever. Now, to me, part of the story, though, is how not big it sort of was. It was kind of noted. Everybody said, okay, Carl, thanks, got it, and everybody's just moved on.
Well, I think that's because we went through this with Michael Sam, which arguably was a much bigger story. For people who have forgotten, Michael Sam was a Missouri defensive end who announced that he was gay, and then before he announced it, before the NFL draft. So you had this huge run-up of a multi-day story surrounding would he get drafted, what was the impact going to be of having an openly gay player in an NFL locker room, and then he didn't make the active roster. Now, he played in preseason games. All of those things took place and were massive stories. But in general, I think probably the reason there's been a relatively muted reaction is, one, this player is not particularly well known, but two, within the last decade, we went through Michael Sam being covered as a major story in the world of the NFL. And so I think a lot of people are over this. I think also in a positive way and a negative way, all people care about with the NFL is whether or not you can perform on the field. So whether you're the NFL Man of the Year or whether you are a guy who's got off-field issues with getting arrested, for instance, most of the time, both NFL teams, players, and fans, all that matters is your production and the individual off the field, for better or worse, when it comes to pretty much anything, doesn't really matter. It's all about your production, and certainly even fantasy football has made that even more paramount, I think, in the world of sports. Fans care about rushing yards, passing yards, touchdowns, sacks, number of points allowed, but they don't really care very much about any of the larger context of athletes, I think, particularly in the NFL.
Clay, finally, do you have any thoughts about this sticky stuff crackdown in Major League Baseball? Pitchers have always cheated. They've always tried to get a better grip on the ball. But the last few years, pitchers care about what's called spin rate. The faster the ball spins, the harder it is to hit. And if you can get a more tactile grip on the ball, it'll come off your fingers faster. And now Major League Baseball, with offense down, is saying, okay, we can't have this anymore.
I think the checks look bad in terms of the way that the game's being stopped. Certainly, we had a Max Scherzer for the Washington Nationals. Scherzer already managing, I believe, the Phillies, the big confrontation there. It gets a lot of attention. I know that Rob Manfred, the Major League Baseball commissioner, has said that he thinks it's working well. I think most fans would disagree with that. The way that it's being implemented right now with checks going on during the course of games, I think for most fans does not make the game look better.
Clay Travis, founder of Outkick, also a Fox News sports contributor. You can hear him daily on the radio, the Clay and Buck Show. Clay Travis, thanks for coming on the Fox News Rundown.
Hey, I appreciate y'all having me. Thanks a lot.
Jason in the House, the Jason Chaffetz podcast. Dive deeper than the headlines and the party lines as I take on American life, politics, and entertainment. Subscribe now on foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
I don't know about you, but I've got a lot of questions when it comes to space travel, and one of them was answered this week. How do astronauts do laundry in space? Well, it turns out they don't. The Associated Press reports that the astronauts wear their undies, their gym clothes, and everything else until they just can't stand themselves any longer. Then they throw the clothes away. And am I the only one with a mental picture of somebody's worn-out T-shirt floating through space? Well, NASA says it's doing something about the dirty laundry situation. It is teaming up with Procter & Gamble to figure out how to clean astronauts' clothes in space so they can be reused just like we do here on Earth. This week, Procter & Gamble announced it will send a pair of Tide detergent and stain removal experiments to the space station later this year and next year, all part of the galactic battle against soiled and sweaty clothes. Rocket cargo space is tight and expensive, according to NASA, so why waste it on new outfits if you could just wash the ones you've got? When you figure an astronaut needs 150 pounds of clothes in space per year, that adds up quick, especially on a 3-year Mars mission. In its initial experiment, Procter & Gamble says it will send up detergent custom-made for space in December, so scientists can see how the enzymes and other ingredients react to 6 months of weightlessness. And then next May, stain removal pens and wipes will be delivered for testing by astronauts. Procter & Gamble is developing a washer and dryer combo that could operate on the moon or even Mars using minimal amounts of water and detergent. A machine like that could also prove useful here on Earth, too. So here's to that time-honored Earth tradition of Laundry Day, soon coming to an International Space Station near you. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Joe Concha.
What's on your mind?
The Washington Post urges Americans to set up white accountability groups. No, really. Well, it's official. The Post, which used to be one of the most respected publications on the planet, has gone full activism. It is actually asking white people to create whites-only, quote, accountability groups, unquote, and meet regularly and indefinitely, like this is Alcoholics Anonymous, while forcing themselves into a, quote, period of deep shame, unquote, over their race. So wait, this is supposed to improve race relations? Because at last check, the greatest leader of the civil rights movement, I believe his name was Martin Luther King Jr., once said we should not judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But at the Washington Post in 2021, they're telling us to do the exact opposite and categorizing people by the color of their skin, which is literally the definition of racism. Congratulations, WAPO. You just succeeded in dividing the country even further while turning your paper into a laughingstock. Democracy dies in darkness indeed. I'm Joe Concha.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From the Fox News Podcasts Network.
I'm Ben Domenech, publisher of The Federalist, and I'm inviting you to join a new conversation with the smartest thinkers out there about the country and where we're going. Subscribe to the Ben Domenech Podcast.
Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.